Imagine a sound, not the blast of a cannon or the cheer of a charge, but a low, seismic murmur, felt in the bones before it's heard in the ears. The synchronized footfall of over 500,000 men, the creak of 200,000 wagon wheels, the snort of 150,000 horses, the jingle of harnesses, the murmured gossip in a dozen languages, the distant chorus of regimental bands playing La Victoire est à nous. This is the sound of an empire on the march, a glittering, arrogant beast of conquest moving with the terrifying confidence of a force that believes it has rewritten the rules of destiny itself. It is the sound of June 1812. Now hold that sound in your mind and replace it just 6 months later with a different soundtrack, the howl of a wind that knows no mercy, scouring a landscape bleached of all color and life. The brittle, sickening snap of frozen cloth being peeled from a corpse. The faint, hopeless gnawing of a man trying to eat his own leather cartridge belt. The shallow, rattling breath of a soldier dying of typhus in a ditch. And beneath it all, a vast, suffocating silence, broken only by the whimpers of the dying and the distant, mocking whoop of a Cossack patrol. This is the auditory journey of the most catastrophic military campaign in European history, a symphony that begins in a major key of supreme arrogance and ends in a minor key of unimaginable desolation. Two numbers, stark and terrible, encapsulate the entire devastating movement. 685,000 souls crossed the Niemen River into Russia in the summer of 1812. 40,000 broken specters stumbled back that winter. The difference, 645,000 lives, vanished into the Russian earth, a loss so vast it defies comprehension, a statistical black hole that swallowed cities' worth of men. Welcome to my history channel, where we don't just recount history, we step into its boots, feel its chill, and listen to its haunting echoes. Today, we embark on an epic, tragic, and deeply human odyssey into the heart of Napoleon's frozen hell. This is a story of hubris on a biblical scale, a clash not just of armies, but of an entire world against the indifferent, brutal forces of nature and a people's defiant, burning will to survive. If you can already feel the chilling contrast between those two sounds, the drumbeat of invincible invasion and the silence of the mass grave, then do this channel a great service and hit that like button now. It tells YouTube you value storytelling that doesn't just inform, but immerses and devastates, that you crave the full, unflinching human drama of the past. And it is the fuel that allows us to produce deep dives of this monumental scale. What follows is the complete, unvarnished, and emotionally resonant saga of the 1812 disaster, a tale where history itself becomes a relentless, freezing antagonist. To understand the sheer, breathtaking scale of the folly, we must first appreciate the zenith from which the fall began, to feel the intoxicating aura of invincibility that clung to the Grande Armée like gunpowder smoke. The force that assembled in the Duchy of Warsaw in June 1812 was not merely a military force. It was a traveling civilization, a panoramic, breathing snapshot of an entire continent, subjugated and orchestrated by one man's iron will. Picture the scene on the sun-drenched banks of the Niemen River, not a uniform mass, but a kaleidoscope of colors, textures, and sounds, a living tapestry of empire. At its hardened, veteran core stood the French grognards, the grumblers. These were men whose faces were maps of Napoleon's rise, lined by the sun of Egypt, scarred by the musketry of Marengo, hardened by the frosts of Austerlitz. They wore the iconic blue greatcoats, now faded to 100 different shades by sun, rain, and powder burns. They moved not with the crispness of parade, but with the loose, economical gait of predators, masters of their trade, their eyes holding the cold, knowing glint of conquerors who had seen kings flee before them. They spoke in the rough argot of the camp, and their loyalty to their little corporal was a fanatical personal religion. Flanking this corps was the empire in microcosm. The Polish lancers of the Vistula Legion were a vision of flamboyant despair, their blue and crimson uniforms brilliant, their lance points catching the sun, their hearts tethered to a single, burning hope that Napoleon was the archangel who would finally resurrect their partitioned homeland from the graves carved by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Their gallantry was edged with a suicidal longing. Next, the disciplined Swiss infantry in red, bound by mercenary contract and a fierce, professional pride. The Dutch grenadiers, remnants of a kingdom created by Napoleon for his brother, contingents from every corner of the Confederation of the Rhine. Saxons with their superb artillery, Westphalians, Bavarians, Württembergers, their loyalties often purchased or coerced, their presence a testament to political calculation. From Italy came cavalrymen whose uniforms were works of art, their passions as quick and hot as the southern sun. From the Illyrian provinces, tough, mountain-bred soldiers, even a unit of reluctant Spaniards, ghosts of the brutal Peninsular War, marched under the shadow of the eagle, a stark, living symbol of Napoleon's overstretched imperium. This was a force unprecedented not just in size, but in logistical complexity. It was a city on the move, accompanied by a tale of staggering proportion. Thousands of non-combatants, surgeons with their grim, blood-caked kits, paymasters with locked iron chests, cartographers frantically sketching inaccurate maps, Napoleon's personal administrative staff, the intendants, with their mountains of paper orders. There was a traveling library for the emperor, a mobile printing press to churn out triumphant bulletins, and even, astonishingly, a contingent of the Comédie Française theater troupe, their costumes packed alongside. Cannonballs, ready to perform Molière for headquarters in conquered palaces. The supply train was its own universe, over 25,000 wagons, a crawling metropolis of canvas and wood intended to carry flour, biscuit, rice, and vast quantities of brandy, the soldiers' liquid courage and calories. But herein lay the first, fatal, and profound miscalculation. Napoleon's genius was for lightning movement and living off the land, in the fertile, compact chessboards of Central Europe like Italy or Germany. His entire operational mindset was one of rapid, decisive climax. He calculated with a logician's cold certainty that the Russian campaign would be over in 20 days, 3 weeks of decisive maneuvering, one great, crushing battle of annihilation, and a peace treaty signed before the autumn leaves fell. Therefore, the army carried only minimal reserves, a bet placed on speed and Russian capitulation. They were an instrument forged for a swift surgical strike, a scalpel. They were about to be thrown against a vast, dense, and unforgiving anvil. The emperor himself was at the peak of his powers, yet also at the peak of his dangerous isolation. The bold young general who once slept among his men was now a distant, sacrosanct figure, surrounded by marshals, Murat, Ney, Davout, who had grown rich, titled, and sometimes hesitant, their revolutionary fervor softened by palaces and princedoms. The critical, challenging voices of earlier years were silenced by yes-men. When his Polish mistress, Countess Marie Walewska, whom he genuinely loved, clung to him and begged with tears in her eyes not to go, seeing only a consuming darkness ahead, he gently dismissed her fears as womanly intuition. When his most brilliant cavalry commander, his brother-in-law Marshal Murat, King of Naples, grew restless and flamboyant during the initial marches, Napoleon snapped that he was a fool in love with glory who doesn't know his own mind. The machine was too large, its commander too convinced of his own celestial fortune to heed the whispers of doubt. The die was cast. The crossing of the Niemen on June 24th was stage-managed as a sublime spectacle of raw power. 3 pontoon bridges were thrown across the green water by the tireless engineers. For 3 days and nights, under a pale Baltic sun that barely set, the endless columns passed in a hypnotic, terrifying river of men and steel. Infantry divisions in tight, multicolored blocks, artillery trains with their polished bronze 12-pounders, The beautiful daughters of the army, the magnificent cavalry reserve, 40,000 strong, the cuirassiers like moving iron fortresses, their steel breastplates and helmets gleaming dully, the chasseurs in green, the flamboyant hussars with their braided pelisses slung over their shoulders, the armored carabiniers. It was a display meant to awe the distant Russian scouts and, crucially, to hypnotize the army itself with its own irresistible might. But the land offered its first stark omen immediately. Eager to reconnoiter, Napoleon spurred his horse forward onto the Russian bank. The animal, perhaps sensing the unseen tension, shied violently, reared, and threw the emperor unceremoniously into the mud. A superstitious hush fell over the glittering staff. The master of Europe, soiled and humbled in his first step onto enemy territory. He rose quickly, brushed the dirt from his green colonel's uniform, and with a forced levity, declared to those around him, "The soil of Russia is eager to receive me. It leaps up to embrace us." The jest was hollow. The incident was recorded in a dozen anxious diaries. The land, it seemed, had already rejected him, and this land would be his first, most patient enemy. The initial advance was into a haunting, unnerving emptiness. The Russian strategy, masterminded by the prudent, Germanic-born general Barclay de Tolly, was one of deep, strategic withdrawal. He understood Napoleon's game and would not play it. He would lure the glittering serpent in, stretching its lines to the breaking point, making the supply nightmare a visceral reality. The army marched through Lithuania, but the towns were often deserted, the granaries emptied, the wells fouled. The sheer, suffocating vastness of Russia began its psychological work, a slow drip of dread. In Germany or Italy, a day's march might bring you to a new city, a fresh valley, a tangible goal. Here, the horizon was an infinite flat line of scrawny pine, birch, and poor, sandy soil. The sky was a huge, oppressive bowl. The roads, mere tracks, turned to choking dust in the June heat, filling lungs and coating everything in a fine, talcum-like powder. Then the summer rains came, and these tracks transformed into impassable quagmires, wagons sinking to their axles, men marching knee-deep in cold, sucking mud. The distance from the Niemen to Moscow was over 500 miles. Every mile forward was a mile further from supply, a mile deeper into a hungry, whispering void. And hunger came quickly, a gnawing companion from the start. The foraging system, so effective in the farm-rich German states, collapsed in the sparse Baltic countryside. The massive cavalry screens, the elite dragoons and hussars, sent out in sweeping arcs to find food, would return empty-handed or not return at all, having been harassed, ambushed, and picked apart by the first tentacles of the Russian response, the Cossack patrols. These were the eyes and teeth of the retreating army, men born to the saddle and the steppe, who could live on a handful of millet and sleep in the saddle. They appeared like phantoms from the dense forests, unleashed a volley of shots, cut down a few foragers, and vanished before a counter could be formed. The horses, the essential, living engine of Napoleon's mobility and shock power, began to die in catastrophic, unnerving numbers. Without adequate grazing in the poor land, forced to march immense distances on terrible tracks, and fed improperly, they succumbed to exhaustion, colic, and simple starvation. Thousands of carcasses were left to bloat and rot by the roadside, their stench a pervasive plague, their loss a creeping death sentence for the artillery and supply trains they were meant to pull. But a more intimate, democratic, and invisible killer was already threading through the ranks, burrowing into the very fabric of wool and flesh. Epidemic disease. Typhus, the camp fever, carried by the body lice that thrived in the unwashed uniforms and the crowded, filthy bivouacs, became the army's grim, impartial reaper. The symptoms were a horror script. A healthy man could feel a headache at dawn, develop a raging, delirious fever by noon, be covered in a dark, mulberry-colored rash by evening, and be dead by the next morning. There were no hospitals, only the so-called flying ambulances. Simple wagons that quickly became rolling coffins, jolting over the ruts, their occupants often left behind when the horses died. Men who could not keep up were abandoned by the road with a crust of bread and a few comrades, a gesture of mercy that was really a death sentence. Doomed to be found by the Cossacks, or simply to vanish into the forest. The army was melting away from the inside, dissolving before a single major battle had been joined. By the end of July, before Smolensk, the Grande Armée had lost over 100,000 men to sickness, desertion, and the draining demands of garrisoning the ever-lengthening, vulnerable supply line back to Prussia. Morale, that intangible force Napoleon had always wielded like a psychological weapon, began to curdle. The veterans grumbled about the Polish mud and the phantom enemy. The conscripts from across Europe, with no deep loyalty to the Emperor or France, dreamed only of home, their resolve thinning with each endless, hungry league. The heat of August was oppressive, a dusty, relentless furnace. And still, the Russian armies retreated, a phantom enemy refusing to be pinned down, trading space for time with a cold, terrifying logic. Napoleon, in his headquarters, grew increasingly frustrated, his strategic brilliance turning brittle. He split his forces in complex, demanding maneuvers to try and trap Barclay de Tolly, further dissipating his own strength across the vast landscape. The campaign was already slipping into a different, darker key, a slow, agonizing slide from triumphant procession to a desperate, hungry pursuit of a ghost. And as we feel the first deep tremors of this colossal mistake, if you're gripped by the unfolding, tragic scale of the disaster, consider anchoring yourself here at my History channel. Subscribing is your pledge to join us in the trenches and on the thrones of history to ensure you never miss a chapter told with this depth of research and emotional power. Because we are now approaching the cataclysm, the moment when the phantom finally turns, bares its teeth, and offers a sacrifice so vast it would scar the land and break the back of the invasion forever. The gates of Moscow and of a far deeper hell lie just beyond the smoke-shrouded fields of a village called Borodino. The Russians finally, decisively, made their stand at a place chosen by their new, revered commander, the old, one-eyed, corpulent General Mikhail Kutuzov. A shrewd survivor of court and campaign, he understood the Russian soul in his bones. The army and the motherland needed a sacred, sacrificial battle, a Borodino, to bleed the invader white, to offer a national martyrdom that would justify the previous months of retreat and fire the resolve for what was to come. He chose his ground carefully, a series of rolling hills and fields, cut by the Kolotsha stream, centered on two key defensive complexes. On the left, a series of 3 arrow-shaped earthworks called the Bagration flesh. In the center, a massive, brutish earthen mound studded with artillery, the Raevsky Redoubt. The position was strong, but not impregnable. Its true strength was in the men who would defend it to the death. On September 5th, the two colossal armies sighted each other, the French vanguard skirmishing with Russian outposts. That night, a strange, solemn, and uniquely Russian ritual took place in the flickering darkness of the defenders' lines. The revered, ancient icon of the Smolensk Mother of God was paraded before the serried ranks of soldiers. As it passed, men, hardened musketeers, young conscripts, gruff artillerymen, fell to their knees in the dirt, crossing themselves fervently, their faces lit by the dance of torchlight, kissing the earth of Russia. They were preparing not just for a battle, but for a holy sacrifice, absolving themselves in advance for the terror to come. Dawn, on September 7th, broke not with clarity, but with a thick, autumnal mist that clung to the low ground, shrouding the armies in an eerie, silent pall. At 6 a.m., the silence was atomized by a single French cannon shot. It was the signal. What followed was not a battle of subtle maneuver, but a day of industrial or concentrated butchery on a scale Europe had not yet witnessed. Napoleon, suffering from a severe cold and a debilitating urinary infection, that left him lethargic, bloated, and uncharacteristically passive, delegated much of the command. He opted not for the brilliant flanking maneuver that was his trademark. Today, the strategy was blunt, brutal, and tragically costly. A massive central artillery bombardment followed by repeated hammer-blow frontal assaults. The French Grand Battery of over 100 guns opened up, a continuous rolling thunder that shook the earth and compressed the chest. The first assaults on the Bagration flèches were exercises in carnage. The French divisions under Marshals Davout and Ney, some of the best infantry in the world, advanced in their classic dense column formation, perfect targets for the massed Russian artillery on the heights. As they marched into range, the Russian guns switched from solid shot to canister, tin cans packed with hundreds of musket balls. At close range, a single round would transform into a widening cone of death, scything down entire front ranks. The description of a soldier seeing the leg of the man beside him vanish in a red mist was commonplace. Yet they came on, clambering over the twitching bodies of their comrades, bayonets fixed, a terrible discipline holding them together through the storm of iron. The flèches changed hands not once or twice, but 7 times in a seething, smoke-choked maelstrom of point-blank musket fire, savage saber slashes, and brute force clubbing with rifle butts. The ground inside these earthworks became a churning, sticky bog of blood, mud, shattered bone, and body parts. Marshal Bagration, the fiery heart of the Russian left, was mortally wounded by a shell fragment, his loss a devastating blow to morale. But the apocalyptic centerpiece of the day was the struggle for the Raevsky Redoubt, the heart of the Russian line. After repeated, blood-soaked infantry assaults were shot to pieces on the slopes, Napoleon, in a bid for decisive shock, unleashed his ultimate weapon, the cavalry reserve. What followed was one of the most spectacular, awe-inspiring, and tragically futile charges in military history. Over 10,000 horsemen, the heavy cuirassiers in their steel armor looking like medieval knights, the Polish light horse, the flamboyant grenadiers à cheval of the Imperial Guard, formed up in a massive shimmering metallic wave. At the command, with a sound like 1,000 thunderstorms rolling into one, they surged forward, up the gentle slope toward the giant earthwork. Russian cannon fire, now at point-blank range, tore lanes of carnage through their packed ranks. Horses and riders went down in screaming, tumbling heaps. But they closed ranks and kept going, the drumming of hooves a terrible, relentless rhythm. They leapt over the outer trenches and poured into the redoubt itself. For nearly an hour, a surreal, almost mythical battle raged inside the earthworks, horsemen slashing down at gunners who fought back with ramrods, sponges, handspikes, and raw courage. It was a scene from a hellish painting. The gleam of sunlight on curved sabers, the flash of point-blank pistol shots in the smoke, the screams of men and horses trapped in a sunken killing pit, the smell of blood, powder, and terrified animals. Finally, supported by a final push of infantry, the French secured the redoubt. The cost was stupefying, the cavalry arm irreparably maimed. By nightfall, as a cold drizzle began to fall, the firing sputtered into an exhausted silence. The Russians withdrew, a short distance in sullen, battered, but good order. The French held the field, littered with the harvest of the day. It was a tactical victory. But it was a Pyrrhic victory of soul-crushing, strategic bankruptcy. The statistics still shock. Between 70,000 and 80,000 total casualties in one single day. The French lost. The French were about 35,000, including 49 generals, the irreplaceable mid-level command. The Russians lost 45,000. The field was so thickly carpeted with the dead and dying that a French officer later wrote he could walk for hundreds of yards without his boots touching the earth. Napoleon had his great, decisive battle, but the Russian army was not destroyed. It was bloodied, anguished, mourning its beloved Bagration, but it was still a coherent, defiant force. its spirit hardened and purified by the colossal sacrifice. The Grande Armée's offensive power was gutted. Its cavalry, the eyes and the swift sword of the army, was crippled, a loss that would prove fatal in the weeks to come. A week later, Napoleon entered Moscow, the ancient, holy capital of the Tsars. He rode through the silent, seemingly deserted streets to the Kremlin, expecting a delegation of trembling boyars to offer the city's surrender and sue for peace. He established himself in the Tsar's own apartments, and he waited. And then the fires began. Whether started by Russian patriots on the orders of the governor, Count Rostopchin, or by drunken, careless looters from the army's own tail, the result was the same. A city built largely of wood became a towering, roaring inferno. For 3 days and nights, Moscow burned, the flames so intense they turned night into a ghastly orange day, the heat so fierce it forced Napoleon to evacuate the Kremlin. He wrote impassioned, almost bewildered letters to Tsar Alexander in St. Petersburg, pleading for negotiation. He received only a wall of silence. For 5 critical, fatal weeks, the greatest general of his age was politically paralyzed, sitting in the ashes of a conquered capital, waiting for a diplomatic solution that would never come. His army, leaderless and bored, descended into a chaotic, destructive orgy of looting. They ransacked palaces, churches, and merchants' houses, filling their knapsacks and wagons with silks, furs, silver plate, icons, books, everything but the flour, hardtack, warm shubas, and horse fodder they so desperately needed. It was a carnival of the damned, a feast before the famine, and with each passing day, the air grew sharper, with a new metallic bite. The first frosts silvered the ruined rooftops and blackened timber. The days grew shorter, the nights longer and colder. The Cossack patrols, watching from the surrounding forests like wolves, grew bolder, their campfires twinkling in the darkness like mocking eyes. On October 19th, nearly a month too late, with the first snowflakes already in the air, the order finally came. The Grande Armée, now a bloated, disorderly, and heavily encumbered column, began its retreat from the ashes. They headed southwest, hoping to find a route through unspoiled country toward the fertile Ukraine. But at the small, obscure town of Maloyaroslavets, they found the revitalized Russian army, now under Kutuzov's firm command, blocking the road. In a vicious, close-quarters street, battle fought from house to house and across a burning bridge. The French fought their way through, but the message was etched in blood and fire. The path to fresh supplies and warmth was closed. Kutuzov had forced them to turn around. They would have to go back the way they came, along the very road they had scorched, stripped bare, and littered with graves on their advance. It was the decision that signed the death warrant of the Grande Armée. The true, multi-layered horror was now inevitable, and the deepest circle of the frozen hell was about to open beneath their feet. The retreat from Moscow is not a single event, but a slow, terrible descent through concentric circles of suffering, each colder, more hopeless, and more dehumanizing than the last. The initial stages in late October were merely grim, chaotic, and disorganized. A long, straggling, snake-like line of men, wagons, cannons, horses, and a desperate train of camp followers, sutlers, wives, children, choking the road, moving at the pace of the slowest ox cart. Discipline was fraying, but not yet gone. Then, on November 4th, the sky darkened, and the first major snowstorm of the winter hit with the force of a physical blow. It was not a picturesque dusting. It was a howling blizzard that buried the world in a deep, featureless, obliterating white, erasing landmarks, filling in ditches, and reducing visibility to a few feet. The temperature plummeted, not gradually, but in a sickening plunge. The general winter the Russians had invoked as a last great ally had arrived, and he brought with him a cruelty beyond any human general's imagination, an indifference that made a mockery of courage and rank. The army was catastrophically, almost criminally, unprepared. The men still wore their lightweight summer greatcoats, and the fine but threadbare wool uniforms that had been issued for the German campaign. The looted Moscow silks, velvets, and clerical vestments were worn as eccentric, pathetic outer layers, providing no insulation against a cold that swiftly dropped to 20, then 25, then 30 degrees Celsius. Leather stiffened, cracked, and fell apart. Boots, already worn thin by 2,000 miles of marching, disintegrated. Men wrapped their feet in strips of cloth torn from tents, then in the bloody hides of slaughtered horses, creating clumsy, shuffling pochki that left dark, bloody prints in the pristine snow, a trail of suffering even a blind man could follow. The road itself transformed into a linear, open-air catacomb, a frozen museum of the damned. Abandoned cannon, their wheels frozen fast to the earth, stood like grotesque modern sculptures. Wagons, too heavy to pull through the drifts, were set on fire for momentary precious warmth, the precious loot inside. Rembrandt paintings, grand pianos, gilded candlesticks, bundles of furs, offering a brilliant, futile, and ironic pyre that illuminated the surrounding horror, the phenomenon of the sitting dead. The road became a linear, open-air catacomb. But the true psychological terror lay not just in the dead, but in the living descent. A new, savage hierarchy emerged, governed by the last remnants of energy. The strongest, those with a hidden reserve of animal will, formed a desperate vanguard. They became scavengers of the weak, not out of malice, but a hollow-eyed instinct that recognized a comrade's frozen body not as a tragedy, but as a resource. A pair of less broken boots, a strip of woolen cloak, a few ounces of frozen marrow from a limb. These were the currencies of survival, and the transactions were silent, swift, and devoid of ceremony. The empire of Napoleon had been replaced by the law of the pack. The horses, those noble creatures whose power had defined the army's glory, now presented the most haunting spectacle of all. A dying horse was an event. Men would swarm the struggling animal not to comfort it, but like moths to a flame of fleeting warmth and protein. As the last breath steamed from its nostrils, knives would flash in the gray light. The meat, sliced thin and consumed half-frozen, was a temporary furnace in the gut. The bones were cracked for marrow. The hide was stripped for foot wraps. Within an hour, a grand cavalry charger would be reduced to a red stain on the snow and a pile of hair-covered scraps, its skeleton picked clean. The men who performed this butchery were not the same ones who had brushed their mounts' coats with pride months before. They were creatures of need, their humanity buried under layers of frost and hunger. And then there was the silence, not the peaceful quiet of a winter's morn, but an immense oppressive auditory void, broken only by the crunch of snow, the rasp of breath, and the endless mournful wind. This silence played tricks on the mind. Men heard phantom regimental music, the laughter of their families, the bells of their village churches, auditory hallucinations born of exhaustion, fever, and despair. Some would stop and turn, peering into the featureless white, convinced they saw a warm inn or their own front door, only to stumble and fall. The illusion shattered. The landscape itself became a hall of mirrors, reflecting only their own impending oblivion. This mental unraveling was the cold's final, most intimate victory. It didn't just kill the body, it dissolved the mind, erasing the memories of home and the sense of self long before the heart stopped beating. They were becoming ghosts before they died, their identities leached away by the monotony of suffering, their past lives feeling like a dream recounted by someone else. It was in this state of collective dissociation, this numb march of automata, that they approached the Berezina River. The crisis of the crossing would not be faced by soldiers, but by survivors already halfway to becoming specters, their wills frayed to a single desperate thread, the instinct to cross, to move west, to escape the white hell that had already consumed their souls. Men who, overcome by a wave of utter exhaustion and lethargy brought on by hypothermia, would decide to sit down for just a moment's rest against a wagon wheel, a tree stump, or the corpse of a horse. The cold would seize them with terrifying, silent speed. Their core temperature would drop, their blood would thicken and slow, their hearts would simply stop. They would remain there, frozen in postures of final, weary respite, eyes sometimes still open, glazed and staring. Thousands of them, a ghostly, silent audience lining the road of the damned, their presence a terrifying warning to those who still moved. Discipline, the final glue that had held the polyglot army together, evaporated entirely, replaced by the raw, primate law of survival. It was every man for himself. The strong shoved aside the weak at a blocked bridge or a narrow pass. Fights, quick and brutal, broke out over a place by a meager fire fueled by a broken musket stock, or over a scrap of frozen horse meat. The shared identity of Frenchman, Pole, Italian, German, it dissolved in the face of primordial need. A French grenadier would rob a Bavarian conscript of his last biscuit without a second thought. A Polish lancer would abandon a wounded Italian comrade to the snow. They were no longer soldiers of a glorious empire. They were a herd of terrified, freezing animals caught in a vast, white trap. And the wolves, the professional hunters of this hell, were always there. Circling, waiting. The Cossacks, born to this climate and terrain, were the undisputed masters of this new kind of warfare. Mounted on hardy, shaggy steppe ponies, wrapped in thick, practical sheepskin shubas, their faces often hidden by ice-encrusted beards, they materialized from the swirling blizzard with chilling, ululating whoops and cries. They would dart in with shocking speed, lance a straggler with a practiced thrust, cut the throat of a man sleeping by a dying fire, and vanish back into the whiteness as suddenly as they appeared, leaving only a fresh, steaming corpse and a spreading crimson stain on the snow to mark their passage. They took no prisoners. It was a pure, efficient hunt. The Russian regular army, now under the relentless, patient command of old Kutuzov, paralleled the French column at a safe distance, always pressing, always harassing with artillery when the terrain allowed, but wisely avoiding a major, set-piece engagement that might allow Napoleon to rally. Their goal was not to defeat Napoleon in a dramatic battle, but to shepherd him to the border of utter annihilation, to let the land and the cold do the killing for them. The ultimate concentrated crisis, the moment when the retreating mass faced total encirclement and destruction, came at the Berezina River in late November. Due to a brief, cruel thaw, the river was a wide, swift, icy torrent, not yet frozen solid enough to bear the weight of men and wagons, but full of dangerous, swirling ice flows. Russian armies under Admiral Chichagov from the south and General Wittgenstein from the north closed in, planning to pin the French against the river and deliver the coup de grace. Napoleon's situation appeared utterly hopeless, the final act of the tragedy. But in a final, brilliant flash of the engineering and command genius that had built his empire, a miracle, or a last twist of cruel fate, was wrought. His surviving corps of Dutch and Polish engineers, under the heroic General Eblé, performed an epic feat of endurance. For 2 days and nights, working in the freezing, chest-deep water, under constant artillery and musket fire from the far bank, they constructed 2 fragile wooden trestle bridges near the village of Studenka. Eblé had, against orders, kept a small forge and a few wagons of tools. This act of insubordination saved the remnant of the army. On the morning of November 26th, under a gray, iron sky, the great, desperate crossing began. What followed was not a military operation, but a primal stampede of sheer, naked terror, a screaming, shoving, hysterical mass of humanity. Soldiers clutching their muskets, women clutching children, the walking wounded supported by comrades, camp followers, and stray dogs, fought with tooth and nail to get onto the narrow, swaying bridges. The structures groaned and sagged under the impossible weight. Men were trampled underfoot. Others, forced off the sides by the press, plunged into the icy water with brief, choked cries and were swept away by the current or pulled under the grinding ice flows. Russian batteries on the commanding hills to the south finally found the range and began pouring a murderous, relentless fire of round shot and shell into the panicked, condensed crowd, on the approaches, and on the bridges themselves. For 2 days and a night, this Dantean scene of concentrated horror continued, lit by the flash of explosions and the glare of burning wagons set alight by the bombardment. The French rearguard, commanded by the indomitable Marshal Ney, now called the bravest of the brave, with a new, desperate meaning, and General Eblé himself fought a heroic, doomed-holding action on the eastern bank, buying time with their lives. Eblé, in a moment of heartbreaking, clear-eyed sacrifice, made the terrible decision to order the burning of the army's remaining pontoon trains and engineering equipment to prevent them from falling into Russian hands. He did this, knowing it also meant that no one left behind after the bridges were destroyed could possibly cross. He stood at the bridgehead until the last possible moment, urging stragglers forward, knowing he was condemning thousands. Finally, in the early morning gloom of the 29th, with thousands of stragglers, camp followers, and wounded still on the wrong side of the river, the order was given. The bridges were set on fire to prevent Russian pursuit. The cries that rose from the east bank were said to haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Women holding infants aloft, wounded men crawling to the edge, all watching their last hope burn. Their screams swallowed by the roar of the flames and the river. The army that crossed the Berezina was a ghost of a ghost. Perhaps 25,000 combatants and a similar number of stragglers had made it, but they left behind at least 20,000 dead, captured, or drowned. The river was choked with corpses for weeks. The final 200 miles to the relative safety of Prussia were a numb, mechanical death march through a featureless white desert, beyond even despair. Men gnawed on tree bark, tore at the frozen flesh of dead comrades with broken teeth, sucked on pebbles to stave off thirst. They would huddle together for warmth in the lee of a snowdrift, only to be found the next morning as a single, frozen, intertwined mound of bodies. By mid-December, the first spectral, scarcely human figures began to stumble across the Niemen River, back into the Duchy of Warsaw. They were unrecognizable even to themselves, skeletal, frostbitten, faces blackened by frostbite and smoke, eyes wide with the blank, thousand-yard stare of profound trauma, dressed in rags, animal skins, and stolen peasant smocks. They were less human beings than walking, breathing testaments to absolute suffering. Marshal Ney, who had fought a relentless, magnificent rearguard action with a handful of devoted men, was reportedly the last Frenchman to leave Russian soil, crossing the Niemen alone on a makeshift raft. The arithmetic of annihilation was now complete, cold, and incontrovertible. Of the 685,000 who had crossed the Niemen with such pomp in June, only about 40,000 recrossed it in December, and fewer than 1,000 of those were still under arms, capable of forming a square. Of the nearly 200,000 horses, the pride of the cavalry, and the lifeblood of the transport, fewer than 1,000 survived. The Grande Armée, the most formidable, complex, and feared military force the world had seen since the zenith of Rome, had not been defeated in a single, clean, decisive battle. It had been subjected to a slow, meticulous, and total process of systematic eradication, consumed by distance, rotted by disease, starved by a barren land and a ruthless strategy, and finally, frozen into oblivion by a climate of unimaginable severity. It was not a defeat, it was an erasure, an uncreation. Napoleon had abandoned the grotesque spectacle of the retreat on December 5th, uttering the cold, pragmatic, and historically resonant words to his secretary, "From the sublime to the ridiculous is but a step," before transferring his command to Murat and racing back to Paris in a closed sleigh under a false name. His mission, to outrun the news, to suppress the scale of the disaster, and to raise new armies from the depleted youth of France. But the truth, carried by the hollow-eyed survivors, could not be hidden. The catastrophe of 1812 was the keystone pulled from the arch of his empire. The myth of his personal and military invincibility lay frozen and shattered on the Russian steppes. The trained cadres of officers and battle-hardened sergeants, The veteran core of his military machine, the men who could turn conscripts into soldiers, were gone. The political and psychological shockwave was immediate and tectonic. Prussia, long a sullen ally, saw its chance for redemption and liberation and switched sides with alacrity. Austria began to hedge its bets. The German states, long suppressed, stirred with a new nationalist rebellion, fueled by the stories of their sons dying for a foreign emperor in a Russian waste. The campaign directly ignited the war of the Sixth Coalition, a true war of liberation that would culminate 13 months later in the three-day Battle of the Nations at Leipzig in 1813, the largest battle in world history until the 20th century, and forced Napoleon's first abdication and exile to Elba in 1814. The retreat from Moscow was the beginning of his end. But beyond the geopolitical earthquake, beyond the shifting borders and the fall of kings, the 1812 campaign endures as one of history's ultimate, timeless cautionary tales. It is a parable about the fatal limits of human ambition, a stark lesson written in ice and blood that the will of a single man, no matter how brilliant, charismatic, or historically potent, can shatter against the combined, immovable forces of a nation's collective resolve. The sheer, strategic depth of geography and the pitiless, absolute indifference of nature. It asks the eternal, haunting question, what is the true cost of glory, of la gloire? The answer is not measured in captured flags, conquered capitals, or dictated peace treaties. It is measured in the 645,000 individual stories abruptly and terribly extinguished. The Polish lancer who dreamed of a Warsaw free, cut down by a Cossack lance. The young French conscript from a Breton village on his first campaign, dying of typhus without firing a shot. The German drummer boy from Württemberg, freezing to death clutching his sticks. The Italian cavalryman from Milan, drowning in the black water of the Berezina. The Dutch engineer who built the bridge to salvation for others, only to be left behind on the bank. Each one swallowed by the vastness. Their fates a silent, powerful, and permanent rebuke to the arrogance of empire. It is the story of an emperor who challenged a continent and was broken, not by a king in a gilded palace or a general on a rival field, but by the whispering snow, the endless distance, and the vast, hungry, patient silence of the Russian land itself. So what do we, witnesses across the centuries, take from this epic, shattering journey from the zenith of confidence to the nadir of despair? It is a story that resonates, because it is, in its bones, deeply and terribly human. It's about the intoxicating, blinding allure of overreach and the devastating, inevitable price of monumental miscalculation. It reminds us that history's most pivotal hinges are often forged, not in clean, heroic victories, but in the messy, brutal, deeply personal, and often silent crucible of immense, shared suffering. If this deep, immersive, and emotionally charged dive into Napoleon's frozen hell has moved you, if you felt the scale of both the towering ambition and the profound tragedy in your very bones, then let's continue this essential conversation. Tell me in the comments below, what specific aspect of this saga haunted you the most? Was it the terrifying, vibrant grandeur of the initial multinational army, the apocalyptic, senseless chaos of Borodino, the silent, uncanny horror of the sitting dead lining the road, the desperate, sacrificial heroism at the Berezina bridges, or the sheer, unimaginable resilience or luck of the few who survived to tell the tale? Your personal reflections and insights are what transform a monologue into a dialogue and make this community a living, breathing forum for history. And if you believe, as we do, that history deserves to be told not as a dry list of facts, but with this level of meticulous detail, raw emotion, and narrative power, then please give this video a massive like. It is the single most powerful, direct way to support our mission here at my History channel. It tells the algorithm that this kind of thoughtful, long-form storytelling has a home here, and it ensures YouTube shows this story to others who crave depth and understanding. Share this video with anyone you know who appreciates epic tales of rise and fall, of strategy and survival, of human folly and endurance against impossible odds. And finally, to make absolutely sure you're with us for our next journey into the heart of another world-altering event. Whether it's the thunderous siege of Constantinople, the eerie mystery of the Mary Celeste, the brutal calculus of the Pacific War, or the forgotten revolutions that shaped our world, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We are just getting started. There are countless more shadows from the past waiting to be illuminated. Countless more echoes waiting to be heard. And we want you there with us as a fellow explorer for every single one. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for caring about the stories that shaped us. Stay curious. And remember, history is not just about dates and names. It's about the echoes of choices, the crushing weight of ambition, the fragility of power, and the indelible, fragile line between triumph and oblivion, a line that, in the winter of 1812, was drawn in ice.